While people are making their way in to the Zoom, I will take this opportunity to introduce myself and make some thank yous and some plugs. So I am so happy to have everyone with us today. My name is Ann Albert, and I am the Klatt Family Director for Public Programs here at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm actually here in the Katz Center, even on this very snowy day, well, maybe less snowy now, snowy day in Philadelphia in January to host the first of this semester's public programs. And I am really excited to get started. So first of all, I want to express gigantic thanks to everyone who has made and who is making these programs possible. So that includes Katz Center staff, including Diana Dennis Walters, Brian Lipscomb, and Becky Friedman, as well as our director and associate director, Steve Weitzman and Natalie Dorman, who support this, this project. Finally, I sincerely want to thank and acknowledge our financial sponsors. So the Klatt family, the Harry Stern Family Foundation, the Katz family, the rest of the Katz Center's board and donors. And in particular, there's a new circle of donors called the Friends of the Katz Center, with whom we like to build a special connection. And if you're interested in joining that group, there should be information about it in the chat shortly, even if you don't see it yet. We are really grateful for, and we really admire all of your commitment to supporting scholarship and expanding its reach. So today's program continues the series that began in the fall called Canon in Context. It's a series of talks in which presenters essentially think historically about major works of Jewish law. The kind of thinking behind this series has to do with the theme of the scholarly fellowship program here at the center this year, which is pre-modern Jewish law. We have visiting scholars from around the world here in the building, working on projects that treat law in theory and in practice as both created by and imposed on Jews. So their research and the conversations that are unfolding here treat the broad context in which Jewish law was developed and in which it operated, seeing law as a necessary component of understanding various aspects of Jewish culture before modernity. And I'll say, even though we are still in the meaty part of the year when we're fully in the midst of these conversations, we are also looking forward to next year when we will move forward to thinking about Jewish law in the modern world. So in connection with that broad theme for this public series, connecting with all of you, we've asked a group of scholars to help us think in particular about canonical works or bodies of Jewish law. So we're thinking about various efforts in the past to compile or codify or organize the multiplicity of the Jewish legal tradition. So these efforts, which have really sometimes reshaped Jewish law and reframed it, are sometimes bold, sometimes very idiosyncratic, and we're looking at how the authors or the compilers of them thought about their work, how they responded to the changes and perceived needs of their time, of their constituencies, sometimes of their own selves. So we hope you'll join us for the rest of this series. We have one more a week from today, we on the Shulchan Aruch with Professor Alyssa Gray. In February, we have two that get a little bit more into book history. So Ted Fram will talk about the composition of the Talmud page or daf, and Joshua Teplitsky will reflect on the place of print and publishing in shaping a wider rabbinic canon towards the end of early modernity and into the modern world. If you want to get up to speed with last semester's talks, which treated the Mishneh and the Talmud, you can see them on YouTube, along with most of the Katz Center's other online public programs, and you should find a link to those in the chat as well. In general, we typically post these programs within about a week of the event, so you can always share or review them if you have missed them. I do want to briefly note that we have some other public programs this semester, not in this series. So for one thing, we are really honored to be hosting Menachem Ben Sasson of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem to talk about the meaning and historical context of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. And last, in February, we are offering a slightly different sort of thing, a 4-week deeper dive, kind of like a miniature university course on Ladino music taught by Edwin Cerruti, who is a winner of the Israel Prize. And a friend of the Cat Center in various ways. It's really wonderful. It's a more intimate setting with more interaction with the presenter. And enrollment for that is limited. We do have a few seats left. So if you're interested in that, you can find information on our webpage. All right, last thing before I introduce the speaker, just a word about protocol for our program today. We have a large number of people in the Zoom, over 200 right now, probably a growing number. So I will be very, very happy to see your questions, and I'll take as many as I possibly can, but please don't be disappointed if I don't read yours out verbatim. With that said, you are welcome to post your questions at any time during this hour using the Q&A button in the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will keep track of them and do my best to address most of the themes that arise. All right, finally, let's move on to introducing today's speaker. We have Eve Krakowski speaking about Maimonides' Mishneh Torah. So Professor Eve Krakowski is an assistant professor of Near Eastern Studies and Judaic Studies at Princeton University. She is a social historian of the medieval Middle East, focusing on the world of especially 11th and 12th century Egypt, the world represented in the documents of the Cairo Geniza. So her research especially explores how law and religion worked in mundane everyday settings, including but not limited to in family life. So her first book was called Coming of Age in Medieval Egypt, Women's Adolescence, Jewish Law and Ordinary Culture. And you might have heard about it because it won the National Jewish Book Award in Women's Studies and a Jordan Schnitzer Book Award from the Association of Jewish Studies, as well as a bunch of other honors. It's really wonderful. I am told that Eve's current project examines how and why new forms of Judaism developed and spread across the Islamic Mediterranean during the 9th and 10th centuries through a social history of Jewish writing. And you can see how that positions her perfectly to think about the themes that we're addressing in this series. And as you're about to find out, we are extraordinarily lucky to have her with us today. So Eve, hello.
Hi, thank you so much, Anne. Thanks for that very kind introduction and for inviting me to join this wonderful series of talks. I watched the other ones on YouTube and I really highly recommend them to everybody if you didn't get a chance already. So I'm going to share my slides now I think they're showing. If by any chance they're not, please somebody pop on screen and let me know. So Anne, when you first invited me to join this series and participate in this series of talks called Canon in Context, you explained it to me as an effort to take a step back, look at major works in the rabbinic legal canon and ask, what the heck is this? Which I thought was a wonderful idea, but it's also a daunting one, especially for this subject, because the Mishneh Torah, which I'm speaking about today, is both the easiest of the great rabbinic legal works to define, but also in some ways the most impossible to explain. So I'll begin with the easy part. First, to briefly review where we are in the story of rabbinic law so far, classical rabbinic literature took shape, sorry for the phone ringing, in late antiquity, especially from the 3rd century on, when the Middle East was ruled by two massive competing empires. And this map, which is the best one out there, is a little frustrating, but because the colors are so close to one another, but this is the Roman Empire here, the sort of more vibrant mustard color over on the left, and this is the Sasanian Empire on the right. The Mishnah was compiled in Roman Palestine, where the red circle is, possibly around the turn of the 3rd century, where numerous other rabbinic works were also composed and or written during the following centuries. By the early 4th century, the rabbinic movement seems to have also been flourishing in Sasanian Babylonia. And this is when the Babylonian Talmud began to take shape and where it eventually reached its final form. In the 7th century, Muhammad's followers, based originally in Arabia, conquered both of these empires and consolidated them politically, first under the Umayyads, who were based in Damascus, and then under the Abbasids in Iraq. Throughout most of this period, throughout both of these imperial periods, until the late 9th century, so near the end of the Abbasid period, we have a very limited view of rabbinic activity. But we do know that it was ongoing, that a range of other rabbinic works were produced in both regions, and it's even possible that the Babylonian Talmud as we know it, although it describes an entirely Sasanian world, its text may still have been being polished or finalized to some degree during this period too, although the many question marks indicate that we don't really know whether that's the case. By the time the Abbasid Empire disintegrated in the mid-10th century, we have a much clearer view, in part because after this, an extensive rabbinic legal library began to develop across the entire region and beyond it, which shared a common textual canon, most centrally the Babylonian Talmud, and a common idiom. These works included written copies of late ancient rabbinic texts, such as the Mishneh and the Talmud. They also included responsa, which are personalized answers to specific rabbinic legal questions, digests of the Talmud, monographs on specific legal subjects, Mishneh and Talmud commentaries, and other kinds of writing, such as theological work with legal content. And all of this material was circulating in writing in the context of a literary explosion in Arabic that also included very similar forms of legal writing. So this is the big picture context in which the Mishneh Torah was born. The Mishneh Torah is a single authored legal code. So unlike the Mishneh and the Talmud, it has a known named human author, and there's just one of him, namely Moshe ben Maimon in the Rambam or Maimonides. The work is written in a very self-consciously clear Mishnaic Hebrew, and it was written in the year 1177 in Fustat, Egypt. In many ways, the Mishneh Torah belonged to this new written medieval rabbinic legal culture that I just described. But at the same time, it was also something new and different. And Maimonides himself acknowledges this difference and novelty in a nice, clear introduction that locates the work within the history of rabbinic Judaism. So that's where I'm going to start. According to Maimonides, the so-called oral Torah, which by this time wasn't oral, it meant this entire written library of rabbinic legal literature, traced back at its core to the revelation at Sinai. So he says all the commandments that were given to Moshe at Sinai were given with their explanations. But these divinely revealed explanations, or what we would call rabbinic laws, were not fixed in a publicly available text that anyone could just access until the Mishnah. So he goes on to say, from the days of Moshe until Rabbeinu HaKadosh, that is Yehuda HaNasi, who's traditionally viewed as the compiler of the Mishnah, they did not compose a text with which to teach the oral Torah publicly. Rather, in each generation, the head of the court or the prophet who lived among that generation wrote himself a record of the reports he heard from his teachers, and he taught it orally in public. And this idea of private written reports that underlie public oral teaching is very interesting in light of current scholarly discussions of how rabbinic, as well as early Islamic legal literature may have been transmitted. But Maimonides then goes on to offer a narrative of crisis. So because of world events, this oral system of transmission was at risk of crashing and burning. And so he, that is Yehuda HaNasi, decided to compose the Mishnah, one text that everyone could possess so that they could study it quickly and it would not be forgotten. He sat all of his days, he and his court, and taught the Mishnah publicly. A few pages after this story, Maimonides goes on to draw a very clear parallel between this act and his own decision to write the Mishneh Torah. He goes through the whole history of the development of rabbinic literature, so through all of this material that was circulating in his day that I was just talking about, and he tells a similar story of crisis. Specifically, he claims that most Jews no longer understand the Talmud, they don't know how to read it properly, and so again, all the knowledge that it contains might be lost. He then says, therefore, I, Moshe ben Maimon HaSfaradi, the Andalusian, decided to compose words that would clarify all of these works, which concern what is forbidden and permitted and pure and impure with all the rest of the Torah's laws, in clear, concise language, so that the entire oral Torah would be organized in the mouths of all with no difficulty or analysis. No, this one says thus and this one says thus. Rather clear, accessible, true words according to the law that is clear from all these works and commentaries that are found from the Mishnah until now. Therefore, I have titled this work Mishneh Torah, a repetition of or second Torah, because a man can first read the written Torah and after that read this and know from it the entire oral Torah without needing to read any other book between them. So the qualities that Maimonides highlights are these. The work is clear and concise, it's organized, and we might also say streamlined in that it doesn't present dissenting opinions. It's true. And most impressively, it's a comprehensive and self-contained summary of rabbinic law that replaces the rest of rabbinic literature. And this is in fact a great description of the Mishneh Torah. Obviously, the part about it being true is subjective, but the rest of it is very accurate. And so now I'm going to try to briefly illustrate how these qualities permeate the Mishneh Torah at varying levels, mostly by contrasting it to the Mishnah, which is the work that it is most self-consciously oriented towards. So I'll start with a bird's eye view of the work as a whole. As Professor Valberg discussed in her lecture on the Mishnah has 6 orders: seeds, which is agricultural laws; holidays; women, which is marriage and divorce laws; damages, which is what we might think of as civil law; sacrifices; and purity. The Mishneh Torah keeps these categories. There we go. It's the same categories, so what it calls times are holidays. And so if we go back to this list of features, right off the bat, this book is comprehensive in the same sense as the Mishnah, in that it too includes a full range of inapplicable laws, which govern things like the temple sacrifices, which no longer existed in the real world. But beyond that, Maimonides also reorganizes parts of these sections and adds others to them that encompass later rabbinic content that's not in the Mishnah. So the book is organized in a very deliberate and systematic manner. And it also includes something totally new, the book of knowledge, specifically theology, astronomy, and physics. That is the Greek astronomy and physics of Maimonides' day. The very first law in the Mishneh Torah is the primary foundation and the basis of all forms of wisdom is to know that there exists a God that is the first being. Maimonides then establishes God's primacy and uniqueness and states that knowing these things about God is a legal obligation. Knowing this is a positive commandment. Anyone who imagines that there is another God transgresses a negative commandment. This God is one. So this is another sense in which the work is comprehensive and organized. Unlike the Mishnah, which starts with a random legal question about the rules governing prayer, from what time can we recite Shema in the evening, the Mishneh Torah starts from first theological principles, with God's existence, primacy, uniqueness, and unity. For Maimonides, you can't start talking about the divine law without first establishing this form of divine being. And this kind of knowledge of God is itself the first law, which of course also means that the work starts with a very strong, truth claim. But these features are visible in other ways too. So I'm going to jump now to the work's micro level treatment of what we more commonly think of as legal content. And I'll use the beginning of the book that I have personally hung out with the most, the laws of marriage. So again, this is the Mishnah. It's the first Mishnah of Kiddushin, the laws of betrothal or acquisition. And this is what it says. A woman is acquired in 3 ways, meaning she's acquired by a husband in marriage, although the Mishnah doesn't make that explicit, and she acquires herself, that is, she leaves a marriage in 2 ways. The Mishnah then goes on to explain just the first part of that statement. What are the 3 ways she's acquired? With money, with a contract, or through sexual intercourse. It then pauses to interrogate just the part about money. So how much money are we talking about here? Beit Shammai said a dinar, Beit Hillel said a pruta. Then it meanders off to briefly discuss what is a pruta, and then it moves on to the next topic, how does she acquire herself? So this is not an especially hard passage by rabbinic standards, but it's also certainly not easy to understand. It's elliptical, it's self-referential, it presents multiple opinions about things without saying which one is right, and it's internally incomplete. So here is what Maimonides does with this. First, he extracts the core normative ideas that this passage presents and repeats them. So first of all, a wife can be acquired in 3 ways: through money, through a contract, or through intercourse. If it's with money, it shouldn't be less than a pruta. But he leaves out everything else, including Beit Shammai's other opinion that it's a dinar. And he reorganizes these principles. So he starts the book of marriage with a totally different introduction, which reads as follows. Before the Torah was given, a man would meet a woman in the marketplace, and if they both wanted to marry, he'd bring her into his house privately, and she would be his wife. Once the Torah was given, Israel was commanded that if a man wants to marry a woman, he must first acquire her before witnesses, and then there's a biblical proof text for this. And then he says, these takings of a wife are positive commandments. So Maimonides first establishes this form of marriage as a religious legal obligation rooted in divine revelation, the giving of the Torah, through a biblical proof text, and through this narrative of what marriage looked like in the pre-Torah era, which sort of sounds like a Jewish version of Islamic accounts of the Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance in pre-Islamic Arabia, although it does have also a kind of obscure rabbinic antecedent. It loosely parallels a passage in the Midrash Bereshit Rabbah. But Maimonides repurposes this obscure passage and uses it to make what is once again an argument about first principles. In this case, that publicly recognized and formalized marriages form a part of a divinely ordered social community. And only after he's established that does he go on to the Mishnah's normative content. A wife may be acquired in 3 ways. He then inserts tons of other material culled from elsewhere in rabbinic literature, establishing the terminology he's going to be using in this section, talking about other basic aspects of marriage, marriage prohibition, the age of maturity, what makes you eligible for marriage, before then moving on to the question of money, the minimal value, a pruta, with which a man can betroth a woman. So here too, the work is clear and concise in that it cuts out legal alternatives and presents one clear law in very easily understood language. It proceeds systematically from first principles, it's organized, it's thorough, and it's self-contained. It defines its own terms, and it doesn't require prior knowledge of other rabbinic sources. So the last quality that I want to address is truth. So what about truth? I'm going to flag one last thing about this before moving on, which again comes from the book's introduction, where Maimonides offers a very peculiar historical narrative that serves to establish the relative authority of rabbinic laws. So as we've already briefly seen, Maimonides claims that the Mishneh captures divinely revealed oral law, so the explanations, that is rabbinic laws, were given to Moshe at Sinai. But he then goes on to describe 2 further historical stages. All rabbinic teachings until the Talmud, when he says there was some sort of trans-regional unity among Jews everywhere, and then stuff that happened after the Talmud, when he says things fragmented, and so anything post-Talmudic is not authoritative. We don't compel the people of one region to adopt another region's customs, and this applies to laws, decrees, and customs that developed after the Talmud was composed. But everything in the Babylonian Talmud is binding on all Jews. They must follow its laws. So the Talmud for Maimonides is the last universally authoritative record of oral Torah. Again, this question of kind of universal acceptance has Islamic overtones. And this is a very different account of the Mishnah and Talmud's formation than you heard if you tuned into the earlier talks in this series. So this is not how scholars today would describe rabbinic history. But it is really important in the context of the Mishneh Torah as a statement of canonical authority that Maimonides is staking out for the Talmud. So for him, the Babylonian Talmud codifies the true law, which the Mishneh Torah aims to capture. So now I'll sum up what I've said so far. What the heck is the Mishneh Torah? It's an epitome or avatar that takes the entire library of rabbinic law as it had developed by Maimonides' day and replaces it with a clear, systematic, self-contained reformulation of Talmudic law specifically, that is Talmudic law according to Maimonides' interpretation of it, bracketed by some basic philosophical, theological, and scientific principles about the nature of God and the universe. So that is very nice. But why would you want to do this? It is a really, really weird thing to do. This is clearly not how rabbinic authors before Maimonides had treated law. And it's also not how you typically wrote anything authoritative at all about law in the medieval Islamic world, where sourcing the specific authority, the specific person who had transmitted a legal tradition, was incredibly important. So the lack of footnotes in this work, so to speak, is totally weird. And where it was also standard to preserve conflicting opinions. So Islamic legal texts are much more in line with pre-Maimonidean rabbinic legal literature on both counts. And things only get stranger if we consider some of the other things that Maimonides said about the Mishneh Torah in his own private correspondence. Maimonides' letters have been collected and translated into Hebrew in this lovely volume by Yitzhak Shelat, and some of them have also been widely translated elsewhere into English. And I'm just going to flag two passages from his letters. First, Maimonides seems to have written to his student Yosef ben Yehuda, the intended purpose of what is recorded in the Talmud and elsewhere, meaning elsewhere in rabbinic literature, has ceased and perished. Today, scholars strive to waste time with the Talmud's argumentation, as if its original purpose had been merely to practice debating. That was not the point originally. Rather, the Talmud's argumentation and debate only developed accidentally. The original point was only to know what one must do or avoid. So all the beautiful dialectical back and forth and interpretive multifacetedness that make the Talmud what it is, that is all a bug, not a feature. It has little intellectual value, and it obscures the actual point of the Talmud, which is to capture normative law. Elsewhere, Maimonides wrote to the same student that he'd be better off just studying the Mishneh Torah and its closest predecessor, the work of Al-Fasi, the Rif, and mostly ignoring the Talmud. So he tells him, I advise you to put your energy into trade and reading medicine together with real Torah study. And what is real Torah study? Study only the laws of Al-Fasi and contrast them to my work. If they contradict, know that contemplating the Talmud will indicate why. If you find a conflict between them, then you can go back to the Talmud, but otherwise it is a waste of time and of little benefit. So again, where was Maimonides coming from with this? Why did he take this stance? So there has been so very much written on Maimonides across the ages and also in the last few decades in scholarship that I am not going to try to answer this question comprehensively. What I'd like to do is go through some of the ways that scholars have answered the question, none of which are necessarily exclusively correct, so they may sort of overlap with one another, and none of which is necessarily entirely correct. First, scholars have sought to understand this endeavor in light of Maimonides' own personal biography. The few things we know about Maimonides with certainty are that he was born in Cordoba around 1135. Sometime during the 1150s, his family lived in Fez. In the 1160s, his father died and he settled in Egypt, in Fustat, where he lived for the rest of his life and wrote most of his major works. In 1177, the Mishneh Torah. By 1191, he had completed the Guide for the Perplexed. And throughout at least some of this period, he also practiced medicine, including at the state court, and he was a major Jewish communal leader. So these are pretty limited data points, but they're extremely suggestive when we lay them against the background of the period's known events. So when Maimonides was born, Cordoba belonged to the Almoravid Empire, whose founders were originally from North Africa. Almoravids is an anglicization of Almorabitun from the Arabic word for fortress, and by extension for the defense of Islam. As Amira Benison puts it in this excellent recent book, the name denotes the Almoravids' self-presentation as a scholarly, ascetic, and military frontier community. So this was an Islamically conservative leadership, and they were closely tied to the Maliki school of Islamic law. In the late 1140s, Andalusia was conquered by the Almohads, the Almuwahidun, or unifiers, in the sense of divine unification. Also an Amazigh or Berger dynasty, but who professed from North Africa, but who professed a much more radical theology that wove together a number of strands to create what Benison terms the ultimate revived monotheistic message. And who are perhaps most famous, most distinctive for having rejected the traditional dhimma or protection that Islamic governments extended to non-Muslim monotheists, and instead required the Christians and Jews in their territories either to convert to Islam or leave. So there is a lot of debate over what this really meant in practice. It seems quite possible that many Jews living in Almohad territories did not actually convert to Islam, or maybe more likely that they converted in only a very minimal sense, which is possibly what Maimonides' own family may have done. There's a tremendous amount of debate about this too. But in any case, most scholars do think that the Almohad conquest explains why the family left Cordoba. And while it's not clear why they then went to Fez, which was the Almohad heartland, this is also likely why Maimonides ultimately ended up in Egypt. So one way to understand all of this is that Maimonides was the proud heir of a long, rich, and very self-conscious Jewish Andalusian tradition of philosophical and legal inquiry. In fact, as we've already seen, he often identified himself this way as a Sfaradi, who found himself in Egypt in a very different Jewish cultural setting that he found vastly inferior. A lot of scholars have taken Maimonides' attitudes about Egyptian rabbinism at face value and described him as a sort of lion among gnats who just couldn't handle the ignorance and stupidity of Egyptian Jewish leaders. I have to say that as a historian who studies and loves medieval Egypt's Jews, I kind of resent this. I don't think we should take this characterization at face value, but I do find very compelling the idea that Maimonides spent his adult life in a kind of spiritual exile, and that his gloomy account of the historical crisis that the Mishneh Torah was supposedly responding to, so the supposed loss of knowledge of what the Talmud really means that the book was aiming to recuperate, had to do with this profound sense of personal dislocation. Ross Brand has just written a wonderful book, Iberian Moorings, about the idea of Andalusian specialness among medieval Muslims and Jews, where he describes someone else, this is actually not about Maimonides, but I borrowed it because it works, who traveled to the East as a self-styled Andalusi abroad, thoroughly invested in campaigning for the idea of Sephardi exceptionalism. So this is one important context for the Mishneh Torah, not least because beyond the Talmud itself, its rulings rely most obviously on Andalusian and North African, rather than Iraqi or Syrian or Egyptian precedents. All that said, there is also a very different way to think about this history and its impact on Maimonides, which is to consider how the Almoravids and Almohads may have influenced his thinking in a positive sense. And that's what Sarah Strumza does in her wonderful book, Maimonides in His World. Strumza points out that the Almohads were legal reformers who emphasized the unity, not just of God, but of the law, who avoided multiple interpretations and citation of secondary sources beyond the Quran and Hadith, and who stressed logically derived knowledge of a unified and unique God as the basis of Islamic law. So for example, if we compare a letter that the first Almohad caliph reportedly circulated to his subjects, enjoining them to first begin with the first principle of Islam and inculcate the people with the knowledge of divine unity, no action on their part will be correct, and no word, there's a typo here, will be acceptable without their understanding the Tawhid, the divine unity. This notion of divine unity and the law certainly belongs to the same conceptual universe as the beginning of the Mishneh Torah. The primary foundation and the basis of all forms of wisdom is to know that there exists a God that is the first being. Knowing this is a positive commandment. This God is one. So there's clearly very striking resonance here. All that said, I think we shouldn't overstate this. It's not a perfect match. So far as we know, the Almohads did not produce a legal code that looks like the Mishneh Torah, and Maimonides did not necessarily share their completely totalizing legal sensibility either. Mark Herman, who is one of the current Katz Center Fellows this year, argues in a chapter of a fantastic book that he is currently writing, so it doesn't yet have a title, but look out for it, on Jews' ideas about the oral Torah in the medieval Islamic world, which I thank him very much for sharing a draft of with me, that Maimonides' legal approach more closely resembles Almoravid Malikism than that of the Almohads. And Herman points out very perceptively that the issues at stake in this question map onto a bigger debate about the Mishneh Torah's idea of law more generally. Namely, did Maimonides think that the Mishneh Torah was a very good attempt to represent the law, or did he actually think it was the law? Moshe Halbertal has called these two options the moderate reading of the Mishneh Torah, which sees it as an accomplished representation of the law, and a more radical reading, which would lie closer to so-called Almohad fundamentalism, although Halbertal doesn't engage with that part of the history, which sees it as the law itself. Okay, so what I've said so far are a few contrasting historical and what we might call ontological approaches to Maimonides' project. But as Anne said when she was introducing me, I am a social historian. And so my interest in the Mishneh Torah actually lies primarily in its importance for social history. So in closing, I would like to suggest that if we approach the book from that perspective, from the perspective of social history, we immediately run into a different set of questions altogether. One of the most interesting works on Maimonides that has come out recently is Mark Cohen's Maimonides and the Merchants, which uses Geniza documents to better understand the Mishneh Torah. As I'm sure many of you know, the Geniza collection is a massive cache of fragmentary texts that survived by accident in a storage room in Fustat in Egypt, and which include around 40,000 everyday documents. So things like commercial letters, administrative letters, legal records, and accounts, mainly from Egypt and Syria from about 1000 to 1250, a time span that covers Maimonides' entire life in Fustat. Maimonides is a big presence in the Geniza. Many of his responsa, individual rulings that he issued in response to legal queries, survive there. So did a few fragments of his writing in his own hand, including this tiny piece of the Mishneh Torah. But somewhat surprisingly, while there's been some really, really excellent work on Maimonides' life through the Geniza, in particular a current project being spearheaded by Mordechai Akiva Friedman and Amir Ashur, nonetheless, scholars have rarely used this incredible source space in a more indirect way to try to understand what Maimonides was aiming to accomplish with the Mishneh Torah. And that's the window that Cohen opens with this book. He argues convincingly that Maimonides was writing with an eye towards a real live audience, and that despite Maimonides' Talmudic conservatism, there are things in the Mishneh Torah that don't make Talmudic sense unless we think about them in light of contemporary social practices that the Geniza shows us. So in other words, the argument is that Maimonides uses Talmudic categories and language to address and create norms around common practices of the time that older rabbinic sources do not address. Cohen focuses on mercantile law, but I think there are similar traces elsewhere throughout the book. And in fact, that we can think about some of the most famously disconcerting passages in the Mishneh Torah this way. And many of these passages have to do with Maimonides' approach to women. So I'm just going to give one example. In the laws of marriage, Maimonides states, every woman has the right to leave her marital home to go to her father's home to visit him. So this is a married woman. She can leave the home that she lives in as a married woman to visit her father and to go to a house of mourning and a house of feasting in order to be kind to her friends or relatives so that they will come visit her. She is not in prison such that she may not come and go. However, it's shameful for a woman to be constantly leaving, now to go out and then to go in the streets. Her husband may prevent her and permit her to leave only around once or twice a month, depending on the need. For a woman's greatest beauty is to sit in the corner of her home, for thus is written, all the king's daughter's glory is inside. Most of the details in this passage come straight from rabbinic sources, which overall promote what I think of in my own work as a kind of moderately patriarchal approach to husbands' control over their wives' movements. So as Maimonides puts it, on the one hand, she's not in prison, but on the other hand, she shouldn't be constantly running around in the marketplace. And both of those images do come from rabbinic literature. There's one part of this passage that is really mysterious. The idea that a husband should permit his wife to leave the house only once or twice a month. Some scholars have vaguely chalked this up to so-called Islamic patriarchal norms. I'm personally not convinced that this has a clear analog in Islam, also doesn't in rabbinic literature as far as I know. I have no idea where it comes from. If anyone has ideas in the Q&A, I would love to hear them. But what I strongly suspect is that this passage in general and this detail in particular also offer us an example of Cohen's thesis, That is that Maimonides here is importing a particular social norm of the time about women's mobility in marriage into the Mishneh Torah and rabbinicizing it. But what is especially interesting in this case is that this social norm wasn't actually universal. Rather, it was a site of active contestation. Geniza marriage contracts make clear that many Jewish women in this period explicitly refused to submit to this kind of control in marriage contracts, and that when they did submit to this kind of control, that was something that they explicitly had to agree to in their contract. So for example, in this contract, a husband promises that he will not prevent his wife from going to all the places that Maimonides singles out and more. He cannot prevent her from going either to the synagogue, to the bathhouse, to places of celebration or mourning, going out to do business, to sell and buy plaques, and he may also not prevent her from going to her sister's chamber and visiting and frequenting her whenever she wishes. So the Mishneh Torah here is prescribing a particular ideal, what I think is Maimonides' culturally inflected interpretation of how rabbinic law should apply to this contested question. The people in Egypt clearly not only didn't always buy into, but that they sometimes actively disputed, even through the rabbinic courts who oversaw these kinds of contracts. And this brings me to my final point. Was the Mishneh Torah intended as a practical code of law? So in some sense, I think the answer is yes, and Cohen's book certainly makes a very good case that this is the case, at least up to a point. But I would suggest that this is nonetheless a very tricky question that, for all the attention that has been lavished on Maimonides, is worth thinking about in more detail in conversation with Geniza documents. Several of the previous speakers in this series have emphasized the extent to which all rabbinic legal codes are, in a sense, utopian. Unlike responsa, which address real-life legal questions, rabbinic legal codes present an imagined ideal reality that often diverged dramatically from what was actually happening in the world. That is just as true of the Mishneh Torah as of the Mishnah, in the sense that it includes discussion of the temple sacrifices, which didn't exist anymore, and so on. But even more than that, I would suggest that the Mishneh Torah distills an ideal vision of the law that doesn't always match reality, even when it could have done so, even when Maimonides could have worked to clarify more the practical import and implementation of the laws he was curating. So for example, the Geniza preserved thousands of legal documents that reflect an extremely complicated system of rabbinic legal courts in Egypt. These courts operated in a legally pluralist marketplace, so to speak. So Jews could go to Jewish court, but they could also go to other kinds of courts. And they depended on a kind of mix of soft epistemic or religious authority, social capital, and hard power provided indirectly by the state in order to function. They had no means to punish anyone physically. Maimonides was involved in these courts extensively, although not directly as a judge, and he knew their limits very, very well. So it has been super frustrating to me for years in my own work that the Mishneh Torah does not give us anything like a realistic portrait of Egypt's medieval rabbinic courts. Instead, it talks at length about a system of rabbinic courts and judges that mostly did not exist at all in Maimonides' day. So this is how he starts that section of the work. It is a positive commandment to appoint judges and overseers in every region. And then he goes on to say, what are overseers? These stand with a rod and a strap before the judges and circulate in the markets and the streets in order to strike all transgressors, and they follow the judge's orders entirely. So these people did not exist. And while that's clear from the account, this is the only account he gives. Whereas the few legal mechanisms that we know Maimonides did rely on in his own life as a communal leader, so for example, responsa, are mostly absent from the Mishneh Torah, which suggests to me that whatever Maimonides was aiming to produce with this work, whether it was an epitome of the law or the law itself, the law he had in mind was not purely pragmatic, but something more abstract and idealized in every respect. And while long-term, the Mishneh Torah did push Rabbinic Judaism in a more codified normative direction, as you'll learn in the rest of this series, I would like to end very briefly with a few poignant notes about what happened when this idealism met reality. So it's very well known that almost no one has ever read the Mishneh Torah the way Maimonides seems to have intended, as a replacement for rabbinic literature. Instead, it has much more often been used as a platform for further in-depth Talmudic analysis of the type that he despised. But what I learned for the first time while preparing this talk is that even Maimonides himself could not escape the Talmud in his own lifetime. This is clear from a very different letter from the ones I showed you earlier, in which Maimonides not only denies that he had ever intended to replace the Talmud, so I never said that, God forbid, but he also admits that he himself has been stuck studying the Talmud rather than the pure Torah study focused on the Mishneh Torah he'd envisioned. The knower is my witness that it's been a year and a half since anyone has learned my own work, the Mishneh Torah, with me. Most of the scholars run to study the laws of the Rif of Al-Pasi, and 2 scholars asked to learn Talmud, so I taught them the tractates they requested. Finally, Maimonides reveals in his most moving surviving letter that he himself could not always live up to the Mishneh Torah's idealized law either. In the laws of mourning, Maimonides summarizes rabbinic mourning laws with an admonition which once again reflected cultural ideas that were prevalent but contested in his own day, that people should greet loss with endurance. A man should not take the deaths of his loved ones too hard, for this is the way of the world, and one who torments himself over the way of the world is a fool. Rather, he should cry for 3 days, eulogize for 7, and refrain from cutting his hair for 30. And yet, when Maimonides' own brother David drowned at sea, he was heartbroken, and he wrote this in one of his other letters: "For around a year from the day I received the evil news, I remained flat on my bed with terrible rashes and inflammation and heartbreak. Even until today, around 8 years later, I mourn and am not comforted. How should I be comforted? Whenever I see his handwriting or one of his books, my heart turns over and my grief awakens." 8 years is a lot longer than 30 days. So if the Mishneh Torah represents in some ways the apex of the impulse to codify rabbinic law, to take all its glorious messiness and multivalence and complexity and boil it down to a set of pure, clear rules for proper human conduct, as Maimonides understood proper human conduct through his own Andalusian, possibly Almohadi philosophical lens, this was a poignantly beautiful, masterful effort that never materialized fully in the real messy human world. Not only because Maimonides' vision included laws that were obsolete, and not only because it moved between an imagined reality and actual reality in complicated ways, but also because even Maimonides himself could not always live up to the pure, austere model of human conduct that it presents. And I will end there.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful to listen to, and there are a lot of questions already being posted, so I'm going to do my best to continue to keep track. So I think where I want to start is close to where you ended. We have a question that's asking about Maimonides' awareness of the theoretical rather than immediately practical or necessarily realistic nature of some of the decisions. And I wanted to ask you if you could say a little bit more about that relationship between theory and practice, or between utopia and reality, as he was, after all, a leader also in the Jewish world, among real people trying to achieve real aims in his world. And so maybe speaking a little bit about the social world that he's operating in, and how this work connects to his real life aims and practices.
Yes, thank you very much for the question and for the chance to clarify. So this is sort of, I ended here because to my mind, I often complain as a scholar of the Geniza that like people write more about Maimonides than about the entire like 200-year span around him in which he lived, that the Geniza shows us. But that said, I actually think this is one area that could, I think, stand a little bit more inquiry, which is like, if we compare what he's saying to the world the Geniza shows us, what exactly did he think the book was going to accomplish? So Mark Cohen's book has made a huge contribution to that. What I was trying to say at the end is something a little beyond that. So Maimonides makes clear often, not always, but often in the Mishneh Torah, when he is talking about a law that is currently relevant or that is not currently relevant. So it's not that that he's pretending that like the temple is still standing or something like that. That's not what I'm saying. But in the same way that he adjusted certain Talmudic laws and certain maybe in order to accommodate contemporary practices or ideals that he had based on the culture that he was living in, he doesn't do that as much as he could have, nearly as much. And so the example I was bringing from the courts is that he could have done what he does, which is present this kind of idealized vision of the ancient Sanhedrin and the way the courts are supposed to operate, and in Palestine, out of Palestine, which is what he goes through. And then he could have also inserted some material about how courts actually work, how responsa work. I'm so sorry, my phone keeps ringing. I'll wait for 1 second. But he doesn't do that. He just sort of stops short of doing that. And I don't know why. I mean, I'm just thinking off the cuff here. Sometimes I've wondered if it's because he actually didn't want to admit how weak and contingent the court system really was. I don't know, but he just doesn't go there. He sticks there and in many other places with the more idealized vision.
Interesting. So does he, we have another question that came in, which I think is an interesting one. Does he acknowledge his own subjectivity here? In other words, does he acknowledge his own role in coming to the final decision, and that others might disagree? And connected to that, can you talk a little bit about if there was a reaction to this work among Egyptian Jews and in his immediate context?
Yes. So first of all, I apologize. I'm just going to break for one second because I see in the Q&A that somebody has objected to one of my translations, and I was thinking about saying this explicitly. The first halakha in the Mishneh Torah in the manuscript I was using, which is a very good manuscript which claims to have been corrected against his own text, does have the word God. So I just want to clarify that. I wasn't making that up. And sorry to interrupt. Now you're asking me about his own subjectivity.
But 1 second, just because the audience can't see the questions. So can you just explain what the question was that you were responding to?
So I don't know if it's worth taking time to reshare my slides, but when I was talking about the very first beginning of the Mishneh Torah, where he says that there is a God that is a first being, somebody who knows this material very well, understandably and correctly objected that it doesn't say that in the printed editions that we have, and maybe in some of the manuscripts too, I don't know. But I was showing a picture of a manuscript, an early manuscript of the work, which does in fact have the word. So that's why I included the word there. Sorry, that's a little detailed, but the kind of thing scholars get agitated about. Okay, so you were asking me about his subjectivity. So I think the best way to answer this is by talking about something I didn't really have time to include in the talk that much, which is Maimonides' attitude to the Geonim in Iraq, who were the people who really were probably responsible for canonizing the Babylonian Talmud in the first place, and who had a very deep tradition of interpreting it, and they issued many, thousands, hundreds of thousands of responsa, and they also wrote legal monographs and commentaries on the Talmud. He sort of very overtly rejected their authority. So that's part of what that whole everything after the Talmud, is not binding is about. And he does sometimes reference them. So does he sometimes acknowledge his subjectivity? I think one way to answer this is that he does sometimes say, some of the Geonim have said this, and I disagree with them. In my mind, the way that he treats them is a little bit like how the Karaites treated rabbinic sources in his own day. So the Karaites were these medieval Jews who rejected the oral Torah, but that didn't mean that they didn't sometimes cite interpretations or engage with them, but they didn't see them as binding. So he does sometimes, he doesn't cite specific authorities, but he sometimes says some of the Geonim have ruled such and such, and he'll explain why he disagrees or what he thinks about what they have to say.
Thank you. So actually building on that a little bit, we have some other questions about how he related to what came immediately before him or around him. So can you talk a little bit more about Al-Fasi as a precursor or as a predecessor, his attitude towards Al-Fasi and what Al-Fasi's impact was, what that was about?
Yes, so he revered Al-Fasi, and that, as you noticed from the citations that I brought, so Al-Fasi's laws are not like the Mishneh Torah in the various ways that I presented them, but it is a comprehensive sort of legal digest and work that consolidates law in sort of the same way as Maimonides was doing, but in a very different format. And Maimonides saw himself as his intellectual and spiritual, I guess, heir when it came to law. And as you saw, he recommended that, that people study him alongside Alfasi as opposed to alongside the Talmud. And it seems that Alfasi was like incredibly, I mean, if we go based on Geniza manuscripts, he's very well represented. So this was a very, very popular, widespread, important work. And this is where, you know, to the extent that Maimonides sort of rejected the Gaonim, where would he situate himself? It would be in that line instead.
Can you also say a little bit about how the Mishneh Torah is distinguished from Maimonides' other works, like the Sefer HaMitzvot? Like, what makes it different? What is he trying to achieve differently in this work?
Yeah, so I thought you were going to ask me about the guide, which is a more kind of striking comparison. But this is the distillation, and his other, the commentary on the Mishnah and the Sefer Mitzvot are, they give more of his reasoning. They tie what he is saying in Mishneh Torah more closely to rabbinic sources, but these works all, in terms of their content, I think, closely overlap with one another. On the occasions that I've like in detail tried to study something that he was saying in the Mishneh Torah, it's often very illuminating to go back and compare it to the sections where he talks about the same law in the other works, because you can often uncover his reasoning more there. Those are less, I mean, they're also incredibly important works, but they are less unique, one of a kind, idiosyncratic than the Mishneh Torah.
So did he have a contentious relationship in the world, in real life, with Gaonim of his age, or with other rabbinic decisors who might have viewed his sort of all-encompassing rejection of other discussions as presumptuous?
Okay, he had an incredibly contentious relationship with many people. He really, really disliked this Gaon in his own day. This is a very interesting and weird question, because we don't actually know what happened to the Gaonic academies after the early 11th century in a lot of details. And then all of a sudden we get to this period and this guy pops up with kind of claims to authority. There is a scholar working on him now as a figure. She's working on the Gaonim in general, Jenny Grayson, so I would look out for her forthcoming book. But anyway, he's kind of the arch foil in Baghdad in Maimonides' writings. Maimonides also hated the leaders that he shared space with in Egypt. And another way of accessing Maimonides' like humanity is by reading the things he has to say about these people in his letters. You know, it makes you feel a little less bad for having petty thoughts about people you know, because like, you know, he got really worked up. He had very strong opinions. And then he also had very, very strong, beautiful, warm friendships with people that he saw eye to eye on. And this comes out through his letters. What's really interesting about Maimonides in his own time is that he actually, for most of his life, did not occupy the position of head of the Jews, which was the sort of official communal position in this period. As far as we can understand, and this is based on Mordechai Akiva Friedman's work, based on documents that kind of refer to the authority of the head of the Jews, Maimonides only held this position briefly for various periods in his life. And most of the time he wasn't the head of the Jews, but he seems to have been kind of usurping the head of the Jews, who he has a lot to say about and how stupid he is, in other ways that are very interesting also to think about in terms of the Mishneh Torah and what his project is. So he used responsa, which I kept talking about, and he also used tekanot or decrees as a kind of, which tekanot had not been used in the immediate period before Maimonides came on the scene in Egypt, as a kind of way to seize practical authority from this state recognized guy. There was also a dynastic turnover at the state level in Egypt in this period, and that may also play a factor in what's going on here. It's not clear, but like he wasn't, you know, he wasn't a politically quiet, but he was very unusual in the way that he maneuvered politically in the community.
It really is amazing for most people who have only encountered the text to think about Maimonides as a kind of political actor in the real world of, you know, insulting and dealing. One more question, if we can hold you for another 90 seconds, going in a fairly different direction though, is about the inclusion of the section on knowledge. And I wonder if you can talk briefly about in what way Maimonides understood or framed beliefs or science or theology as obligated, as law, as opposed to just content that people should have at their fingertips.
That's a wonderful question. And I will have humility and admit that this is not actually my area of expertise. And when you first asked me to give this talk, I was nervous because I was like, I'm not really a Maimonides person, because Maimonides people do philosophy and science. And I took these things in grad school many years ago, but this is not what I focus on. The truth is that I should say that I think there's a lot written on this and people should just go look at it. But when it comes to, he does frame certainly the theological content as sort of obligatory and binding. And that was what a lot of the controversy around him was about. He then includes a bunch of scientific material, and I really ought to know whether he also says you have to believe this, but I honestly don't. But anyone could just go look that up. I just don't remember. So I'm glad to, since my whole point here was that nobody is really sort of like all-knowing, I'm glad to end on a note that I don't know the answer to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's actually really important for everyone to hear examples of knowing where your limits are. That is fantastic. I've really appreciated this hour, and you probably haven't been following the Q&As, but there's a lot of notes of thanks and appreciation rolling in there as well. So I want to thank you on behalf of all of us here at the Cat Center and in the audience for this really meaningful and enlightening hour. And we hope to see you again.
Thank you so much.